In the neon-lit streets of South Philadelphia, where cheese steaks sizzle and old-world traditions die hard, one man's story reads like a modern-day Shakespearean tragedy. This is the tale of Joseph "Skinny Joey" Merlino, a man who rose from the row houses of South Philly to become the most notorious mob boss of his generation, only to watch his empire crumble in the digital age. Tonight, we journey through 5 decades of loyalty, betrayal, violence, and ultimately, reinvention. Before we dive deep into Joey's world of organized crime, family loyalty, and the changing face of the American Mafia, I want to know, where are you watching from tonight? Are you settling in from New York, Philadelphia, maybe somewhere across the globe? Drop your city in the comments below. And what time is it where you are? Whether you're winding down after a long day, or it's the perfect late-night story time, this tale of Skinny Joey is going to take you on an unforgettable journey. If you're ready for a couple of hours of the most captivating true crime storytelling, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because stories like this, told in this depth, are what this channel is all about. Give this video a like if you're ready to hear about one of the most complex figures in modern organized crime. Now, let's begin. March 13th, 1962, St. Agnes Hospital in South Philadelphia. As the cherry blossoms began to bloom along the Delaware River, Rita Merlino gave birth to a son who would one day become the most infamous mob boss in the city's history. Joseph Salvatore Merlino entered the world weighing just over 6 pounds, earning him a nickname that would follow him for life, Skinny Joey. His father, Salvatore "Chucky" Merlino, was a man who understood the streets. A bookmaker and numbers runner with connections that stretched deep into Philadelphia's underworld, Chucky had built a modest criminal enterprise in the shadow of South Philly's towering crime families. He wasn't a made man, not officially, but he commanded respect in the neighborhood. He paid his taxes to the right people, kept his mouth shut when necessary, and provided for his family through a combination of legitimate work and street smarts. Rita came from a different world, but one equally steeped in tradition. Her family had immigrated from Sicily in the early 1900s, carrying with them the old-world values of family loyalty, honor, and the understanding that sometimes justice came not from courtrooms, but from the streets. She was a devout Catholic who attended Mass daily at St. Paul's Church on Christian Street. But she also understood that her husband's business dealings required a certain flexibility when it came to moral absolutes. The South Philadelphia of Joey's childhood was a world unto itself. Narrow row houses lined streets where Italian, Irish, and Jewish families had carved out their territories through decades of immigration and assimilation. The smell of tomato sauce and garlic wafted from kitchen windows, mixing with the industrial odors from the shipyards along the Delaware. This was a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where loyalty was currency, and where reputation could determine whether your children walked home safely from school. Young Joey's education in the ways of the street began before he could properly tie his shoes. At age 5, he would watch from the front steps of his family's row house on Broad Street as his father conducted business with men who spoke in whispers and shook hands like they were sealing contracts worth millions. These weren't rough-looking thugs from the movies. They were well-dressed men who drove nice cars and treated Joey's mother with the kind of old-world respect that was becoming rare in America. Chucky Merlino understood that knowledge was power, and he began teaching his son the fundamental lessons of street life early. "Joey," he would say, "you got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. You listen twice as much as you talk, and you'll never go wrong." It was advice that young Joey took to heart, developing an almost supernatural ability to absorb information while keeping his own counsel. The neighborhood provided its own classroom. South Philadelphia in the late 1960s and early 1970s was still largely segregated by ethnicity. with Italian Americans dominating certain blocks while Irish and Jewish families controlled others. For a boy growing up in this environment, understanding territorial boundaries and showing proper respect weren't just social niceties. They were survival skills. At St. Monica's Catholic School, Joey was an average student academically, but demonstrated an exceptional ability to read people and situations. Sister Mary Catherine, his third-grade teacher, would later recall that young Joseph had an uncanny ability to diffuse tense situations between classmates and seemed to possess a natural charisma that drew other children to him. He wasn't the smartest boy in class, she remembered, but he was certainly the most persuasive. By age 10, Joey was spending more time on the streets than in the classroom. This wasn't uncommon for boys in his neighborhood. The streets were where real education happened. He learned to play poker and shoot craps in the back rooms of neighborhood social clubs. He discovered which corners were safe and which belonged to crews that didn't welcome outsiders. Most importantly, he began to understand the complex web of relationships, debts, and obligations that governed life in South Philadelphia. The early 1970s were a turbulent time for Philadelphia's organized crime families. The Bruno crime family, led by the enigmatic Angelo Bruno, controlled much of the city's rackets through a combination of violence and political corruption. But Bruno's reign was marked by internal tensions and challenges from younger members, who felt the aging Don was too conservative in his approach to business. Joey's father, Chucky, navigated these dangerous waters with the skill of a veteran diplomat. His bookmaking operation paid tribute to the Bruno family while maintaining enough independence to keep food on the table and clothes on his son's back. For young Joey, watching his father balance respect with self-preservation provided an early lesson in the delicate art of survival in the criminal underworld. The boy was fascinated by the men who would visit his father's social club on Oregon Avenue. They spoke in a mixture of English and Italian phrases, their conversations peppered with references to people and places that seemed to exist in a parallel universe. Names like Tony Bananas and Johnny Keys weren't just colorful nicknames. They were brands, reputations built through decades of criminal enterprise and street credibility. As Joey entered his teenage years, the Philadelphia mob was undergoing seismic changes. Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don who had maintained peace through diplomacy rather than violence, was gunned down outside his South Philadelphia home in March 1980. The killing, ordered by the Genovese crime family in New York, sent shock waves through the Philadelphia underworld and triggered a period of instability that would last for decades. For 18-year-old Joey Merlino, Bruno's assassination wasn't just another mob hit. It was a business opportunity. The power vacuum created by the Don's death meant that ambitious young men with street smarts and courage could potentially rise faster than would have been possible under the old, more rigid hierarchy. The lessons of his childhood had prepared him for this moment. He understood loyalty, but he also understood that blind loyalty could get you killed. He respected tradition, but he recognized that the world was changing, and those who adapted would survive, while those who didn't would perish. Most importantly, he had inherited his father's ability to read people and situations, combined with his mother's fierce determination to protect family at all costs. In the months following Bruno's death, South Philadelphia became a chessboard where every move carried potentially fatal consequences. Joey watched and learned as various factions within the crime family jockeyed for position. He saw how quickly alliances could shift, how yesterday's friend could become tomorrow's enemy, and how survival often depended on being 3 steps ahead of everyone else. The young man who emerged from this period of chaos was markedly different from the skinny kid who had grown up playing stickball on Broad Street. Joey Merlino, at 18, was lean and wiry, with dark eyes that missed nothing and a smile that could charm a nun or intimidate a loan shark, depending on the situation. He dressed well, not flashy, but with a kind of attention to detail that commanded respect in his neighborhood. Most importantly, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood power and wasn't intimidated by it. By 1980, Joey had assembled a small crew of childhood friends and neighborhood acquaintances who recognized his potential for leadership. These weren't sophisticated criminals. They were young men from the neighborhood who specialized in small-time gambling, bookmaking, and the occasional robbery. But what they lacked in experience, they made up for in loyalty and ambition. Among this early crew was Michael Mikey Chong Concaglini, whose family had deep connections to the Bruno crime family. There was also Steve Matson, a tough kid from the neighborhood who had earned respect through his willingness to use violence when necessary. These relationships, forged in the playgrounds and street corners of South Philadelphia, would prove crucial in Joey's rise to power. The crew's early criminal activities were relatively modest. They ran numbers games in local bars and social clubs, collected debts for local loan sharks, and occasionally engaged in burglary and robbery when opportunities presented themselves. But Joey understood that these activities were merely stepping stones to something larger. He was building a reputation, establishing credibility, and most importantly, learning the intricate details of how organized crime actually operated at the street level. What set Joey apart from other young criminals in the neighborhood was his strategic thinking. While others focused on immediate profits, he was building relationships and accumulating favors that could be called in later. He understood that in the world of organized crime, information was often more valuable than money, and reputation was worth more than both combined. The education of Joey Merlino was nearly complete. He had learned the lessons of the street, absorbed the traditions of his neighborhood, and developed the skills necessary to survive in one of America's most dangerous criminal environments. But survival wasn't enough for young Joey. He had his sights set on something much more ambitious. As 1980 drew to a close, the stage was set for the next phase of Joey Merlino's transformation from neighborhood kid to criminal mastermind. The Philadelphia mob was in chaos, creating opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. And Joey Merlino, armed with 18 years of street education and surrounded by a crew of loyal followers, was ready to make his move. The skinny kid from Broad Street was about to become a player in one of America's most dangerous games. The next 2 decades would see him rise to heights of power and influence that few could have imagined. But they would also test every lesson he had learned about loyalty, betrayal, and survival in the unforgiving world of organized crime. The assassination of Angelo Bruno in March 1980 created a power vacuum that ambitious young criminals throughout Philadelphia were eager to fill. For Joey Merlino, barely 18 years old, but already wise in the ways of the street, Bruno's death represented the opening of a door that had previously been locked shut. The old guard was dying, literally in many cases, and the future belonged to those smart enough and tough enough to claim it. In the immediate aftermath of Bruno's murder, the Philadelphia crime family descended into chaos. Philip Chicken Man Testa, Bruno's underboss, assumed control but lasted only a year before being killed by a nail bomb planted under his front porch. The bombing, which occurred in March 1981, sent another shockwave through South Philadelphia and further destabilized an already fractured organization. Joey watched these events unfold with the calculating eye of a chess player studying his opponent's moves. Each assassination, each power grab, each failed attempt at consolidation taught him valuable lessons about the nature of power in the criminal underworld. Most importantly, he learned that in times of chaos, opportunity belonged to those willing to take calculated risks. His first significant criminal enterprise began modestly enough. In late 1981, Joey and his crew took control of several illegal gambling operations in South Philadelphia, using a combination of violence and negotiation to force out competitors and establish their territory. These weren't the sophisticated casino operations portrayed in movies. They were basement poker games and corner dice games that served the working-class Italian-American community. But Joey understood that respect in the criminal world came not from the size of your operation, but from your ability to protect what was yours and expand when opportunities arose. He made sure that his gambling operations were run professionally, that debts were collected efficiently, and that disputes were resolved quickly and definitively. Word began to spread throughout South Philadelphia that skinny Joey Merlino was a young man to be taken seriously. The Philadelphia mob landscape of the early 1980s was dominated by several key figures, each representing different approaches to organized crime. Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, had emerged as the family's new boss, bringing with him a reputation for ruthless violence that made even hardened criminals nervous. Unlike the diplomatic Angelo Bruno, Scarfo believed that fear was the most effective tool for maintaining control. Joey studied Scarfo's methods with the intensity of a graduate student researching his dissertation. He observed how the new boss used violence, not just as a tool of punishment, but as a means of communication. A beating sent a message about disrespect. A murder eliminated a problem, while warning others not to create similar problems. But Joey also noticed the limitations of Scarfo's approach. Fear could create obedience, but it could also create enemies who would wait for the right moment to strike back. This lesson would prove prophetic. Scarfo's reign of terror eventually turned many members of his own organization against him, leading to a series of betrayals that would decimate the Philadelphia crime family by the end of the 1980s. But in the early years of Scarfo's rule, Joey Merlino was focused on learning everything he could about the business of organized crime. Through his father's connections and his own growing reputation, Joey gained access to the inner workings of various criminal enterprises. He learned how loan sharking really worked, not just the collection of payments, but the psychology of debt and the careful calculation of interest rates that would maximize profit without pushing borrowers to desperation. He studied the intricacies of labor racketeering, watching how mob-connected union officials could control entire industries through strategic strike threats and sweetheart contracts. Most importantly, Joey began to understand the political dimensions of organized crime. The most successful criminals weren't just tough guys who could collect debts and intimidate competitors. They were businessmen who understood how to corrupt officials, manipulate legal systems, and create legitimate fronts for their illegal activities. This was the difference between street-level thugs and true criminal masterminds. By 1983, Joey Merlino had established himself as one of the most promising young criminals in South Philadelphia. His gambling operations were generating steady profits. His crew was growing in size and capability, and his reputation for both intelligence and ruthlessness was spreading throughout the city's criminal underworld. But reputation in the mob world required more than just business success. It required the willingness to use violence when necessary, and the intelligence to know when violence was counterproductive. Joey's first major test came in the form of a territorial dispute with an older crew that had been operating bookmaking games in South Philadelphia since the 1960s. The conflict began over something relatively minor, a disagreement about which crew had the right to operate in certain neighborhoods. But in the world of organized crime, small disputes could quickly escalate into matters of life and death. The older crew, led by a veteran criminal named Tommy DeSimone, viewed Joey's expanding operations as an insult to their established territory. Rather than backing down or seeking mediation from higher-ranking mob figures, Joey chose to handle the situation directly. In a carefully planned operation, his crew disrupted several of DeSimone's gambling operations, sent clear messages to his customers about changing loyalties, and made it clear that continued resistance would result in escalating consequences. The confrontation reached its climax in a sit-down meeting arranged at a South Philadelphia restaurant. Joey, barely 21 years old, sat across from DeSimone, a man with 30 years of criminal experience, and calmly explained why the territorial boundaries needed to be redrawn. The meeting lasted 2 hours, and by the end, DeSimone had agreed to cede several lucrative neighborhoods to Joey's crew in exchange for a guarantee of peaceful coexistence. Word of this resolution spread quickly through South Philadelphia's criminal community. Here was a young man who could negotiate from strength, who understood when to fight and when to compromise, and who had the intelligence to resolve conflicts without creating unnecessary enemies. The Skinny Joey Merlino brand was beginning to establish itself in the marketplace of criminal reputation. The mid-1980s brought new challenges and opportunities for Joey and his expanding criminal enterprise. Nicky Scarfo's violent approach to leadership was creating internal tensions within the Philadelphia crime family, leading to a series of internal conflicts that would later be known as the Philadelphia Mafia Wars. These weren't the romanticized gang wars depicted in Hollywood movies. They were brutal, intimate conflicts fought between men who had grown up together, worked together, and in many cases trusted each other with their lives. Friends became enemies overnight. Family members turned against each other, and the traditional codes of loyalty and omerta, the code of silence, began to break down under the pressure of survival. Joey navigated this dangerous period with remarkable skill for such a young man. He understood that taking sides too early could be fatal, but remaining neutral too long could also be dangerous. His strategy was to maintain relationships with various factions while avoiding commitments that could trap him on the wrong side of history. This period also saw Joey's first serious brush with federal law enforcement. The FBI had been monitoring Philadelphia's organized crime activities for decades, but the violence of the Scarfo era had intensified their efforts. Electronic surveillance, informants, and traditional investigative techniques were being used to build RICO, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, cases against mob figures throughout the city. In 1986, Joey was arrested on gambling charges, relatively minor infractions that carried potential sentences of several months in jail. But the arrest served as a wake-up call about the realities of criminal life in the modern era. The FBI wasn't just interested in catching criminals after they committed crimes. They were building comprehensive cases designed to dismantle entire organizations. Joey spent 3 months in county jail, an experience that provided valuable lessons about survival in the criminal justice system. He learned how to maintain respect without creating unnecessary conflicts, how to gather information without appearing too curious, and most importantly, how to use incarceration time for planning and relationship building rather than merely enduring punishment. Upon his release from jail in early 1987, Joey returned to a Philadelphia criminal landscape that had been dramatically altered by ongoing violence and federal prosecutions. Several major figures in the Scarfo organization had been killed or arrested, creating new opportunities for ambitious criminals willing to take risks. Joey's approach to this chaotic environment demonstrated the strategic thinking that would characterize his entire criminal career. Rather than immediately attempting to seize territory or challenge established figures, he focused on building alliances with other young criminals who shared his long-term vision for organized crime in Philadelphia. Among these allies was his childhood friend Michael Mikey Chong Coglini, whose family connections provided legitimacy within the traditional mob structure. There was also Stephen Matsone, whose reputation for violence made him a valuable enforcer and deterrent to potential rivals. Together with several other neighborhood associates, they formed what would later be known as the Young Turks, a new generation of Philadelphia criminals who understood that the old ways of doing business were becoming increasingly obsolete. The group's criminal activities during this period were diverse and sophisticated. They continued to operate gambling enterprises, but they also expanded into loan sharking, labor racketeering, and legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for money laundering. Most importantly, they began to develop relationships with criminals in other cities, understanding that the future of organized crime would require national and even international connections. Joey's leadership style during this period was markedly different from the authoritarian approach favored by traditional mob bosses. He preferred consensus building to dictatorial commands, understanding that voluntary cooperation was more reliable than coerced obedience. This approach not only made him popular among his associates, but also made his organization more resilient to the kinds of betrayals that were destroying other criminal groups. The late 1980s brought a series of catastrophic events that would reshape the Philadelphia mob forever. In 1987, Nicky Scarfo and most of his top lieutenants were convicted on federal RICO charges and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The convictions were based largely on testimony from former associates, who had decided that cooperation with law enforcement was preferable to loyalty to an organization that seemed destined for destruction. For Joey Merlino, then 25 years old and still building his criminal empire, the fall of the Scarfo organization provided both opportunities and warnings. The opportunities were obvious. With the established leadership eliminated, there was room for new players to assume control of lucrative criminal enterprises throughout the city. But the warnings were equally clear. The federal government had developed sophisticated tools for dismantling organized crime groups, and traditional methods of maintaining secrecy and loyalty were no longer sufficient. Joey studied the Scarfo prosecutions with the intensity of a law student preparing for the bar exam. He analyzed which investigative techniques had been most effective, which former associates had become government witnesses, and most importantly, which organizational vulnerabilities had been exploited by law enforcement. This wasn't just academic curiosity. It was professional development for a man who intended to build a criminal empire that could survive in the modern era. The most important lesson from the Scarfo disaster was the danger of excessive violence. Scarfo's reign of terror had not only created enemies within his own organization, but it also attracted intense law enforcement attention and public outrage. Joey understood that successful organized crime in the modern era would require a more subtle approach. Violence would still be necessary, but it would need to be used more strategically and with greater precision. By 1988, Joey Merlino had positioned himself as one of the most promising leaders of Philadelphia's next generation of organized criminals. His crew controlled significant gambling and loan sharking operations throughout South Philadelphia, maintained relationships with legitimate businesses that provided both income and cover, and had established connections with criminal organizations in other cities. But Joey understood that criminal success in the modern era required more than just street smarts and willingness to use violence. It required understanding of legal systems, financial markets, and political processes that were becoming increasingly complex. He began to educate himself in these areas, reading business publications, studying legal precedents, and developing relationships with lawyers, accountants, and other professionals who could provide expertise in areas where traditional criminal knowledge was insufficient. This period also saw the beginning of what would become one of Joey's most distinctive characteristics: his ability to maintain a public profile without compromising his criminal activities. Unlike traditional mob figures who shunned publicity, Joey understood that in the media age, controlled exposure could actually provide protection by making him too visible to eliminate quietly. He began appearing at charity events, neighborhood festivals, and other public occasions where his presence would be noted, but not necessarily suspicious. This wasn't just ego gratification. It was a calculated strategy to build community support and create legitimate cover for his less legitimate activities. The late 1980s also marked Joey's first serious romantic relationship with a woman who would become a central figure in his life. Deborah Wells was a local woman from a respectable family who was initially unaware of the full extent of Joey's criminal activities. Their relationship would provide both stability and vulnerability for Joey. Stability through emotional support and legitimate social connections. Vulnerability through the potential for law enforcement to use personal relationships as leverage. As the 1980s drew to a close, the Philadelphia organized crime landscape was in shambles. The Scarfo organization had been decimated by prosecutions and internal violence, leaving a power vacuum that various factions were attempting to fill. For Joey Merlino, this represented the opportunity he had been preparing for since his teenage years. But Joey also understood that the old model of organized crime, leadership the all-powerful Don who ruled through fear and commanded absolute loyalty, was becoming obsolete. The future would belong to criminal leaders who could adapt to changing conditions, who understood modern business and legal practices, and who could maintain criminal enterprises while minimizing the kind of attention that had destroyed previous generations of mob figures. His preparation for leadership during this period was comprehensive. He studied the successful criminal organizations that had survived federal prosecutions, analyzed the mistakes that had led to the downfall of others, and began developing a leadership philosophy that would guide his future activities. This philosophy emphasized flexibility over rigidity, strategic thinking over emotional reactions, and sustainable profitability over short-term gains. Most importantly, Joey began to envision a form of organized crime that could coexist with, rather than constantly battle against, law enforcement and legitimate society. This didn't mean going legitimate criminal enterprises would remain at the core of his organization, but it meant understanding that successful criminality in the modern era required a more sophisticated approach than the crude methods that had characterized previous generations of mob figures. As 1990 approached, Joey Merlino stood at the threshold of true leadership in Philadelphia's organized crime community. He had survived the chaos of the 1980s, learned from the disasters that had befallen his predecessors, and assembled the resources and relationships necessary to build his own criminal empire. The next decade would test whether his innovative approach to organized crime leadership could succeed where traditional methods had failed. The young man who had learned the fundamentals of criminal life on the streets of South Philadelphia was ready to write his own chapter in the history of American organized crime. But first, he would have to survive the final violent spasms of the old era and prove that his vision for the future was more than just ambitious dreams. The 1990s had been a decade of preparation, survival, and strategic positioning for Joey Merlino. As the new millennium approached, the 37-year-old criminal mastermind found himself uniquely positioned to assume control of what remained of Philadelphia's organized crime family. The violent upheavals of the previous 2 decades had eliminated most of his competition. Federal prosecutions had removed the old guard, and Joey had carefully cultivated the relationships and reputation necessary to claim the leadership role he had been working towards since his teenage years. The path to becoming boss hadn't been straightforward. Throughout the early and mid-1990s, Joey had survived several assassination attempts, navigated complex alliances and betrayals, and gradually consolidated control over various criminal enterprises throughout Philadelphia. His approach during this period demonstrated the strategic thinking that would characterize his eventual reign as boss. He preferred to outmaneuver opponents rather than simply eliminate them, understanding that excessive violence attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement. In 1999, Joey Merlino officially became the recognized leader of the Philadelphia crime family. Though his coronation was far different from the elaborate ceremonies that had marked the ascension of previous mob bosses, there was no formal ceremony, no ritual oaths of loyalty, and no blessing from New York's established crime families. Instead, Joey's leadership was acknowledged through the more practical recognition that he controlled the most successful criminal enterprises in the city and commanded the loyalty of the most capable criminal operators. This unconventional approach to leadership would characterize everything about Joey's reign as boss. While traditional mob leaders sought to maintain their power through fear and intimidation, Joey understood that in the modern era, successful criminal leadership required a more sophisticated approach. He needed to be part business executive, part diplomat, and part public relations specialist, all while maintaining the core criminal enterprises that generated the organization's revenue. From the beginning of his reign as boss, Joey Merlino made a decision that set him apart from virtually every other organized crime leader in America. He chose to embrace rather than avoid public attention. This wasn't mere ego gratification, though Joey certainly enjoyed the spotlight. It was a calculated strategy based on his understanding that in the media age, visibility could provide a form of protection. The comparison to John Gotti was inevitable and largely accurate. Like the flamboyant New York boss who had dominated headlines throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Joey understood the power of cultivating a public image. But where Gotti's public persona had been built on arrogance and defiance, Joey crafted a more nuanced image that emphasized his role as a neighborhood leader and community figure. Joey's public appearances during this period were carefully orchestrated performances, designed to build sympathy and support among the general public, while maintaining his credibility within the criminal community. He dressed impeccably, always in expensive suits that projected success without appearing gaudy. He spoke to reporters with a mixture of charm and careful ambiguity, never confirming criminal activities, but also never appearing to be hiding from legitimate scrutiny. This approach required remarkable skill and discipline. Joey had to maintain his reputation for toughness and leadership among criminals while simultaneously appearing reasonable and non-threatening to the general public. He accomplished this through a combination of selective violence, charitable activities, and careful media management that would have impressed professional public relations experts. The strategy worked, at least initially. Joey became a celebrity in Philadelphia, recognized on the street by ordinary citizens who viewed him more as a colorful local character than as a dangerous criminal. This public recognition provided a form of protection. It would be difficult for rival criminals to eliminate someone so visible, and law enforcement would face public scrutiny for any heavy-handed tactics used against such a well-known figure. Despite his public visibility, Joey never lost sight of the fundamental requirement for any successful mob boss: generating revenue through criminal activities. His organization during the early 2000s was involved in a diverse range of illegal enterprises, each carefully designed to maximize profits while minimizing risks. Gambling remained the cornerstone of Joey's criminal empire, but his approach to illegal gaming was far more sophisticated than the traditional numbers. Games and sports betting operations that had characterized earlier generations of Philadelphia organized crime. Joey's organization operated video poker machines in bars and social clubs throughout the city, ran high-stakes card games that attracted wealthy players from throughout the region, and maintained sports betting operations that utilized modern telecommunications technology to reach customers far beyond Philadelphia's borders. His gambling operations were notable for their professionalism and efficiency. Joey understood that customer satisfaction was crucial for long-term success in any business, even illegal ones. His games were honest. Players who lost did so because of luck or skill, not because they were being cheated. Debts were collected properly, but without unnecessary violence. Disputes were resolved quickly and fairly. This approach built customer loyalty and reduced the kind of complaints that might attract law enforcement attention. Loan sharking was another major revenue source for Joey's organization. But again, his methods were more sophisticated than traditional approaches. Rather than simply lending money at exorbitant interest rates to desperate borrowers, Joey's organization focused on providing capital to small businesses and entrepreneurs who couldn't obtain conventional financing. The interest rates were still higher than bank rates, but they were competitive with other alternative lending sources, and the terms were clearly explained and fairly enforced. This approach to loan sharking served multiple purposes. It generated steady revenue with relatively low risk of violence or law enforcement attention. It created relationships with legitimate businesses that could be valuable for money laundering and other purposes. And it positioned Joey as a community leader who was helping local entrepreneurs succeed when traditional financial institutions wouldn't support them. Labor racketeering represented another significant component of Joey's criminal empire. His organization had influence within several Philadelphia area unions, allowing them to control construction contracts, manipulate wage negotiations, and extract tribute from employers who wanted to avoid labor disputes. But Joey's approach to labor racketeering was more subtle than the crude extortion practiced by previous generations of mob figures. Rather than simply demanding payments in exchange for labor peace, Joey's organization positioned itself as a problem-solving service for both employers and workers. They would mediate disputes, negotiate agreements that satisfied both sides, and provide expertise on complex labor law issues. This approach generated revenue while building relationships and reducing the likelihood of complaints to law enforcement. Joey's most distinctive innovation as a mob boss was his cultivation of a public persona that humanized him while maintaining his criminal credibility. This was a delicate balancing act that required careful attention to every public appearance, interview, and interaction with the media. The centerpiece of Joey's public image was his annual Christmas party for homeless children. Beginning in the early 2000s, Joey would rent a South Philadelphia restaurant or social club and host an elaborate party complete with gifts, food, and entertainment for dozens of disadvantaged children from throughout the city. These events were covered extensively by local media and portrayed Joey as a generous community leader who cared about society's most vulnerable members. The Christmas parties served multiple purposes in Joey's overall strategy. They demonstrated his commitment to the community, particularly to children, which made him more sympathetic to the general public. They provided positive media coverage that could be referenced whenever negative stories appeared about his alleged criminal activities. And they reinforced his image as a traditional Italian-American patriarch who took care of his neighborhood and its residents. But the Christmas parties were just one element of a comprehensive approach to public relations. Joey regularly appeared at neighborhood festivals, charity events, and community meetings. He was always available to local reporters who needed colorful quotes for their stories. He cultivated relationships with local politicians, business leaders, and even some law enforcement officials who appreciated his role in maintaining order in certain neighborhoods. This public visibility wasn't without risks. Every appearance, every interview, and every photograph provided potential evidence that could be used in future prosecutions. Joey understood these risks, but he calculated that the benefits of public support and recognition outweighed the potential legal complications. The strategy also required Joey to be constantly on. He could never appear in public without being perfectly dressed, completely composed, and ready to project the image he had carefully crafted. This was emotionally and physically exhausting. But Joey understood that consistency was crucial for maintaining credibility. By the mid-2000s, Joey Merlino had achieved a level of power and influence that few organized crime figures in American history had ever enjoyed. His criminal organization controlled most of the significant illegal gambling and loan sharking operations in Philadelphia, had influence within several major unions, and maintained relationships with criminal organizations throughout the United States and internationally. But Joey's power extended beyond traditional criminal activities. His public profile and community connections gave him influence within Philadelphia's legitimate political and business communities. Politicians sought his support. Business leaders wanted his approval. And ordinary citizens viewed him as an important neighborhood figure whose opinions mattered. This combination of criminal power and legitimate influence allowed Joey to operate with a freedom that previous mob bosses could never have imagined. He could resolve disputes between criminal associates and legitimate businessmen. He could influence political decisions that affected his neighborhoods. He could even mediate conflicts between law enforcement and the community, positioning himself as a voice of reason and moderation. The financial success of Joey's organization during this period was remarkable. While exact figures are impossible to determine, law enforcement estimates suggested that his criminal enterprises were generating millions of dollars in annual revenue. More importantly, much of this money was being successfully laundered through legitimate businesses and investments, creating a foundation of legal wealth that could support Joey and his associates, even if their criminal activities were disrupted. Joey's lifestyle during his peak years reflected this success. He lived in an expensive home in South Philadelphia, drove luxury cars, wore expensive clothes, and dined at the finest restaurants. But unlike many criminal figures who flaunted their wealth, Joey was careful to maintain a lifestyle that appeared consistent with legitimate business success rather than obvious criminal profits. His home, while expensive, wasn't ostentatious. His cars were luxury models, but not the kind of exotic vehicles that would attract unwanted attention. His clothes were expensive, but conservative, projecting success and respectability rather than criminal excess. This careful attention to image was part of Joey's overall strategy to maintain his public persona while enjoying the fruits of his criminal success. During the height of his power, Joey's organization controlled criminal activities throughout Philadelphia and had expanded into surrounding areas of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. This territorial expansion required careful negotiation with other criminal organizations, strategic use of violence when diplomacy failed, and constant attention to maintaining relationships that could survive the inevitable conflicts and misunderstandings that arose in the criminal world. Joey's approach to territorial control was markedly different from the crude methods used by previous generations of mob bosses. Rather than simply claiming territory through violence and intimidation, he preferred to establish control through business relationships and mutual benefit arrangements. His organization would partner with local criminal groups, providing expertise, capital, and protection in exchange for tribute and territorial recognition. This approach had several advantages. It reduced the violence associated with territorial disputes, which meant less law enforcement attention and fewer opportunities for rivals to exploit conflicts. It created sustainable relationships that could adapt to changing circumstances rather than rigid arrangements that might collapse under pressure. And it allowed Joey's organization to benefit from local knowledge and connections that would have been difficult to develop through direct expansion. The expansion also demonstrated Joey's understanding of modern criminal enterprise. Unlike traditional mob territories that were defined by neighborhood boundaries and ethnic loyalties, Joey's criminal empire was organized around business opportunities and strategic advantages. His organization controlled activities in areas where they could be most profitable, regardless of traditional territorial boundaries. One of Joey's most significant achievements as a mob boss was his ability to maintain productive relationships with other organized crime families throughout the United States. This was no small accomplishment given the suspicion and rivalry that typically characterized relations between different criminal organizations. Joey's relationship with New York's crime families was particularly important since the New York families had historically viewed Philadelphia as part of their sphere of influence. Previous Philadelphia bosses had often found themselves subordinate to New York interests, forced to seek approval for major decisions, and required to share profits from their most lucrative enterprises. Joey's approach to these relationships was diplomatic but firm. He acknowledged the historical importance of New York's crime families and showed appropriate respect for their leaders. But he also made it clear that Philadelphia was his territory and that his organization would operate according to his decisions rather than external commands. This required careful balancing, showing enough respect to avoid conflicts, while maintaining enough independence to preserve his authority within his own organization. The key to Joey's success in these relationships was his ability to provide value to other crime families while maintaining his own independence. His organization had expertise in certain criminal activities that could benefit partners in other cities. His public profile and political connections could be valuable for criminal organizations that preferred to remain completely in the shadows. And his reputation for fair dealing and reliable partnership made him a valuable ally for long-term strategic planning. Joey also developed relationships with criminal organizations outside the traditional Italian-American sphere. His organization worked with Irish, Russian, and other ethnic criminal groups when mutual interests aligned. This cosmopolitan approach to criminal partnerships was another innovation that distinguished Joey's leadership from the more insular methods of previous mob bosses. Despite his careful attention to public relations and strategic planning, Joey's success as a mob boss inevitably attracted intense attention from law enforcement agencies at the federal, state, and local levels. The FBI had been monitoring his activities since the early 1990s, and by the mid-2000s, he was the target of multiple ongoing investigations. The law enforcement pressure took many forms. Electronic surveillance was constant. Joey's phones were tapped. His meetings were recorded when possible, and his associates were under similar scrutiny. Financial investigations tracked his legitimate and illegitimate income sources, looking for evidence of tax evasion, money laundering, and other financial crimes. Traditional investigative techniques were used to build cases around specific criminal activities like gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. But perhaps the most dangerous threat came from potential informants within Joey's own organization. The federal government's witness protection program and reduced sentence agreements for cooperating defendants had proven devastatingly effective against other criminal organizations. And Joey knew that his own group was vulnerable to similar infiltration and betrayal. Joey's response to this law enforcement pressure demonstrated both his strengths and his limitations as a criminal leader. On the positive side, he implemented sophisticated security measures that made it difficult for law enforcement to gather evidence. He compartmentalized his organization so that individual members had limited knowledge of overall operations. He used coded language and indirect communication methods that made conversations difficult to interpret, even when they were successfully recorded. But Joey's public profile, which had been one of his greatest assets during his rise to power, became a significant liability once law enforcement decided to target him seriously. His visibility made him easy to follow and monitor. His media interviews provided statements that could potentially be used against him in court. His charitable activities and community involvement created paper trails that could be analyzed for evidence of illegal income sources. The period from 2005 to 2008 represented both the peak of Joey's power and the beginning of serious challenges to his continued success. His criminal organization was generating maximum revenue. His public profile had never been higher, and his influence within Philadelphia's legitimate community was at its strongest point. But the law enforcement pressure was also intensifying, and Joey was beginning to face the same kinds of internal organizational pressures that had destroyed previous mob bosses. The fundamental challenge Joey faced was maintaining the delicate balance between criminal success and legal survival. His organization needed to continue generating revenue through illegal activities, but every criminal act increased the risk of prosecution. His public profile provided protection and influence, But it also made him an obvious target for law enforcement agencies looking to make high-profile arrests. Joey's associates were also feeling this pressure, and some were beginning to question whether the benefits of continued criminal activity outweighed the risks of lengthy prison sentences. This internal doubt was perhaps the most dangerous threat Joey faced, since it could lead to the kind of cooperation with law enforcement that had destroyed other criminal organizations. The challenge was compounded by Joey's own success. His wealth and influence had given him options that previous mob bosses never enjoyed. He could potentially transition to completely legitimate activities if he chose to do so. But making such a transition would require abandoning the criminal enterprises that had made him powerful. And it would also require trusting that law enforcement would allow him to retire peacefully rather than continuing to pursue prosecutions based on past activities. Throughout his reign as mob boss, Joey struggled to maintain some semblance of normal personal and family relationships. This was complicated by the constant law enforcement surveillance, the security risks associated with his position, and the emotional demands of maintaining his public persona while managing a complex criminal organization. His relationship with Deborah Wells had evolved over the years, surviving multiple arrests, extensive media coverage, and the constant stress of being associated with one of America's most notorious organized crime figures. Deborah had gradually become aware of the full extent of Joey's criminal activities, but she had chosen to remain loyal despite the obvious risks and complications. Their relationship provided Joey with emotional stability and a connection to a more normal life, but it also created vulnerabilities that his enemies and law enforcement could potentially exploit. The safety of family members was a constant concern, requiring security measures that further complicated Joey's daily life and limited his freedom of movement. Joey was also dealing with the aging of his parents and other family members who had been part of his life since childhood. His father, Chucky, was in declining health, but remained proud of his son's success, even though he worried about the dangers associated with Joey's high profile and criminal activities. His mother, Rita, struggled with the constant media attention and law enforcement pressure that surrounded her family. These personal relationships were among the few aspects of Joey's life that remained genuine despite the intense scrutiny from law enforcement and media. But they also represented the human cost of his criminal success, the normal family experiences and relationships that had been sacrificed or compromised by his choice to pursue power and wealth through illegal means. By 2008, Joey Merlino's reign as Philadelphia's mob boss was reaching a critical juncture. The law enforcement pressure had reached levels that made normal criminal operations increasingly difficult. Several of his key associates had been arrested on various charges, and there were growing concerns about potential cooperation with federal investigators. The financial crisis of 2008 was also affecting the legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering and other illegal activities. But perhaps most importantly, Joey was beginning to recognize that the world of organized crime was changing in fundamental ways that made traditional mob leadership increasingly obsolete. The combination of modern law enforcement techniques, sophisticated financial monitoring, and the breakdown of traditional codes of loyalty and silence meant that criminal organizations like his were becoming increasingly vulnerable to detection and prosecution. The man who had spent nearly 3 decades building one of the most successful criminal organizations in American history was beginning to contemplate the possibility that his reign might be coming to an end. The next phase of Joey Merlino's story would test whether his innovations in criminal leadership could survive the ultimate challenge, a sustained, sophisticated law enforcement campaign designed to destroy his organization and send him to prison for the rest of his life. The year 2009 marked the beginning of the end for Joey Merlino's reign as Philadelphia's most powerful organized crime figure. After nearly a decade of unprecedented success, during which he had managed to build a criminal empire, while maintaining a public profile that made him a Philadelphia celebrity. A sophisticated law enforcement campaign that had been building against him for years finally reached the point where federal prosecutors felt confident enough to strike. The investigation that would ultimately bring down Joey's organization had been years in the making. Federal agents from the FBI, IRS, and other agencies had been working together in what they called Operation Brotherly Love, a comprehensive effort to dismantle what remained of organized crime in Philadelphia. The investigation utilized every tool available to modern law enforcement: electronic surveillance, financial analysis, undercover operations, and perhaps most devastatingly, cooperating witnesses from within Joey's own organization. The first significant blow came in March 2009, when federal agents arrested 12 members and associates of Joey's organization on charges ranging from illegal gambling and loan sharking to extortion and money laundering. The arrests were coordinated simultaneously across Philadelphia and surrounding areas, demonstrating the scope and sophistication of the federal investigation. But the most shocking aspect of the arrests wasn't their scope. It was the revelation that several of Joey's most trusted associates had been cooperating with federal investigators for months, secretly recording conversations and providing detailed information about the organization's criminal activities. The traditional Code of Omerta, which had protected organized crime figures for generations, had completely broken down under the pressure of modern law, enforcement techniques, and the prospect of lengthy federal prison sentences. In August 2009, Joey Merlino and 36 other defendants were named in a massive federal indictment that detailed decades of criminal activity by the Philadelphia organized crime family. The indictment, which ran to over 150 pages, painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had generated millions of dollars through illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and other traditional mob activities. But the indictment also revealed the extent to which federal investigators had penetrated Joey's organization. Conversations that Joey had believed were private had been recorded through electronic surveillance. Financial transactions that he had thought were secure had been traced through sophisticated investigative techniques. Most damaging of all, several of his closest associates had been providing detailed information to federal agents about the organization's most sensitive operations. The charges against Joey personally were serious enough to result in a life sentence if he were convicted on all counts. The federal RICO statute allowed prosecutors to treat his leadership of the criminal organization as a continuing criminal enterprise, meaning that he could be held responsible not just for his own actions, but for crimes committed by his subordinates in furtherance of the organization's goals. The indictment was a sobering experience for Joey. Here, laid out in stark legal language, was his life's work described as nothing more than a criminal conspiracy. The charitable activities, the community involvement, the careful cultivation of a public image that portrayed him as a neighborhood leader rather than a dangerous criminal. None of that mattered in the eyes of federal prosecutors, who saw only a sophisticated criminal who had managed to avoid justice for too long. The indictment also revealed how thoroughly the federal government had researched every aspect of his life and organization. They had financial records going back decades, surveillance photographs that documented meetings and activities Joey had thought were unobserved, and testimony from former associates that provided intimate details about conversations and decisions that had shaped his criminal career. Joey's response to the federal charges demonstrated both his intelligence and his understanding of the American legal system. Rather than simply denying all charges or claiming innocence, his legal team developed a sophisticated defense strategy that acknowledged certain activities while challenging the government's characterization of his role and motivations. The defense strategy had several components. First, Joey's lawyers argued that while their client had certainly been involved in illegal gambling and other activities, he was not the criminal mastermind portrayed in the government's indictment. They characterized him as a neighborhood figure who had been involved in relatively minor illegal activities that were common in his community, rather than the leader of a sophisticated criminal organization. Second, the defense team challenged the credibility of the government's cooperating witnesses, arguing that their testimony had been bought with lenient sentences and that they had incentives to exaggerate Joey's role and importance in order to satisfy federal prosecutors. This was a risky strategy, since it required essentially admitting that some criminal activity had occurred while arguing about degrees of responsibility. Third, Joey's lawyers attempted to use his public profile and charitable activities as evidence of his character and community standing. They presented witnesses who testified about his generosity, his involvement in legitimate community activities, and his reputation as someone who helped resolve disputes and maintain order in his neighborhood. The legal proceedings stretched over nearly 2 years, during which Joey's life was completely transformed. The man who had once moved freely through Philadelphia streets, dining at expensive restaurants, and attending high-profile social events was now confined to house arrest and limited to approved activities under strict federal supervision. The period between his indictment and trial was perhaps the most difficult of Joey's entire life. The elaborate lifestyle he had built through decades of criminal success was largely gone, replaced by the restrictive existence of a federal defendant awaiting trial on charges that could result in a life sentence. The financial impact was immediate and severe. Federal asset forfeiture laws allowed the government to freeze bank accounts, seize property, and prevent Joey from accessing most of the wealth he had accumulated over his criminal career. Legal fees for a case of this complexity were enormous, quickly consuming the legitimate assets that weren't subject to government seizure. But the emotional and psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating. Joey had spent his entire adult life building and maintaining relationships based on his power and influence within Philadelphia's criminal community. Now facing the possibility of a life sentence, he watched as many of these relationships dissolved under the pressure of self-preservation. Former associates avoided contact to prevent compromising their own legal situations. Business partners distanced themselves to avoid guilt by association. Even some family members struggled with the stress and publicity surrounding the case. The constant media attention was another source of stress. The same visibility that had been one of Joey's greatest assets during his rise to power now became a liability. Every court appearance was covered by local and national media. Every legal filing was analyzed by crime reporters. And every aspect of his case was discussed endlessly in newspapers, television programs, and online forums. Perhaps most difficult of all was the knowledge that several of his most trusted associates had betrayed him. Men who had shared meals with his family, who had been present at intimate celebrations and private moments, had secretly recorded conversations and provided information that was now being used to potentially destroy his life. The emotional impact of these betrayals was profound, challenging Joey's fundamental beliefs about loyalty, friendship, and the bonds that supposedly held criminal organizations together. Joey Merlino's trial began in February 2011 and lasted for 3 months, making it one of the longest and most closely watched organized crime trials in Philadelphia history. The federal courthouse became a daily spectacle with media representatives, law enforcement officials, and curious members of the public gathering to observe the proceedings that would determine whether one of America's most notorious mob bosses would spend the rest of his life in prison. The government's case was comprehensive and methodical. Federal prosecutors presented evidence that spanned nearly 2 decades of criminal activity, using a combination of surveillance recordings, financial records, and testimony from cooperating witnesses to build their argument that Joey had been the leader of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The most damaging evidence came from the electronic surveillance that had captured Joey in conversations about various criminal activities. While he had been careful to avoid explicit discussions of illegal acts, the recordings revealed a man who was clearly involved in making decisions about gambling operations, loan sharking activities, and the resolution of disputes between criminal associates. The cooperating witnesses provided detailed testimony about the inner workings of Joey's organization. They described meetings where criminal activities were planned, explained how profits were divided among organization members, and detailed Joey's role in making strategic decisions that affected the organization's operations. But perhaps the most compelling aspect of the government's case was its portrayal of Joey as a man who had lived far beyond any legitimate means of support. Financial experts testified about his expensive lifestyle, his luxury purchases, and his inability to account for the sources of wealth that had supported his activities for decades. Joey's defense team faced the challenging task of responding to overwhelming evidence while maintaining their client's dignity and preserving some hope of an acquittal or reduced sentence. Their strategy involved acknowledging certain activities while challenging the government's characterization of Joey's role and the extent of his criminal involvement. The defense presented Joey not as a criminal mastermind, but as a neighborhood figure who had been involved in relatively minor illegal activities that were common in his community. They argued that the government had inflated his importance and criminal sophistication in order to justify the extensive resources devoted to his investigation and prosecution. Character witnesses testified about Joey's charitable activities, his role in resolving community disputes, and his reputation as someone who helped maintain order in his neighborhood. These witnesses painted a picture of a man who was certainly involved in some illegal activities, but who was also a positive force in his community. The defense also challenged the credibility of cooperating witnesses, arguing that their testimony had been influenced by their desire to receive reduced sentences for their own criminal activities. They suggested that these witnesses had incentives to exaggerate Joey's role and importance in order to provide federal prosecutors with the kind of testimony that would justify their cooperation agreements. After 3 months of testimony and evidence, the case went to the jury in May 2011. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning, with a mixed verdict that reflected the complexity of the charges and evidence presented during the trial. Joey was convicted on several counts related to illegal gambling and racketeering, but he was acquitted on the most serious charges that could have resulted in a life sentence. The mixed verdict was viewed as a partial victory by his defense team, though it still meant that Joey faced significant prison time. In July 2011, Joey Merlino was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, a sentence that was substantial, but far less than the lifetime that federal prosecutors had sought. The judge's sentencing decision reflected recognition of Joey's role in criminal activities, while also acknowledging his community involvement and the absence of violent crimes among the charges for which he was convicted. The sentencing marked the end of Joey Merlino's reign as Philadelphia's most powerful organized crime figure. The man who had spent nearly 3 decades building a criminal empire, who had become a celebrity through his public profile and media savvy, was now facing more than a decade in federal prison. But even as he prepared for incarceration, Joey maintained the dignity and composure that had characterized his public persona throughout his criminal career. He accepted the sentence without public complaint, expressed gratitude to his supporters, and prepared to serve his time with the same strategic thinking that had guided his rise to power. The fall of Joey Merlino represented more than just the conviction of another organized crime figure. It marked the end of an era in American organized crime, the conclusion of a story that had begun in the row houses of South Philadelphia and had evolved into one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises of the modern era. The next phase of Joey's story would test whether the man who had reinvented organized crime leadership could reinvent himself once again. this time as something other than a criminal. Joey Merlino entered the federal prison system in August 2011, beginning what would become a transformative 4-year period of his life. At 49 years old, he was no longer the young street tough who had learned the fundamentals of criminal life in South Philadelphia's neighborhoods, nor was he the powerful mob boss who had commanded respect and fear throughout the region. He was now federal inmate number 153888084, confined to the Lewisburg Federal Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania, far from the city he had once controlled. The federal prison system represented a completely different environment from anything Joey had previously experienced. Unlike county jails where he had served brief sentences early in his career, federal prison was designed for long-term incarceration of serious offenders. The inmates included white-collar criminals, drug dealers, organized crime figures, and violent offenders from throughout the United States. Survival and success in this environment required different skills than those Joey had developed during his criminal career. But Joey approached prison with the same strategic thinking that had characterized his entire life. He understood that the next 4 years would be crucial for his future, not just surviving incarceration, but positioning himself for whatever life might be possible after his release. This meant staying physically fit, avoiding the conflicts and violence that could extend his sentence, and most importantly, using his time to plan for a future that might not include traditional criminal activities. The daily routine of federal prison was monotonous but structured. Joey woke at 6 a.m., participated in required activities and work assignments, ate meals at scheduled times, and was confined to his cell during evening hours. But within this rigid structure, he found opportunities for personal development and strategic planning that would prove crucial for his eventual reinvention. Joey's reputation preceded him into the federal prison system, but he was careful to maintain a low profile that didn't invite challenges or conflicts. Other inmates knew who he was, but Joey avoided the kind of prominent leadership role that might attract attention from prison administrators or create enemies among other prisoners. He was respectful to correctional officers, helpful to fellow inmates when appropriate, and careful to avoid any activities that might compromise his eventual release. During his incarceration, Joey spent considerable time thinking about what his life might look like after his release. He was acutely aware that the world of organized crime he had once dominated was rapidly disappearing. Federal prosecutions had decimated most traditional crime families. Modern law enforcement techniques made old-style criminal operations increasingly difficult, and the cultural changes that had supported organized crime for generations were evolving in ways that made criminal leadership less viable. But Joey also recognized that his notoriety and reputation, properly managed, might be assets in legitimate endeavors. His story was compelling, the rise and fall of one of America's last traditional mob bosses. His personality and communication skills, which had served him well in the criminal world, might be equally valuable in legitimate business activities. The challenge would be convincing the world that his transformation was genuine rather than merely tactical. Joey understood that many people would be skeptical of any claims about going legitimate, viewing such declarations as publicity stunts or attempts to avoid continued law enforcement scrutiny. Proving the authenticity of his transformation would require more than just words. It would require sustained actions that demonstrated a genuine commitment to legal activities. Joey also had to consider the practical realities of life after prison. His assets had been largely seized by the federal government. His criminal organization had been destroyed by prosecutions and defections, and his options for generating income through traditional criminal activities had been severely limited by continued law enforcement attention. Whatever future he built would need to be based on legitimate activities that could survive scrutiny from law enforcement, media, and skeptical observers. During his years in prison, Joey began developing the concept that would guide his post-release. Activities leveraging his notoriety and South Philadelphia heritage into legitimate business opportunities. The idea wasn't entirely original. Other former criminals had successfully transitioned into legitimate activities by capitalizing on their reputations and stories. But Joey's approach would need to be particularly sophisticated given his high profile and the continued interest in his activities from various quarters. Joey Merlino was released from federal prison in April 2015, having served 4 years of his 14-year sentence. His early release was the result of good behavior, participation in prison programs, and federal sentencing guidelines that allowed for reduced sentences under certain circumstances. But his freedom came with significant restrictions. He was required to serve 3 years of supervised release, during which his activities would be closely monitored by federal probation officers. The Philadelphia Joey returned to in 2015 was significantly different from the city he had left 4 years earlier. The economic recession had affected many of the neighborhoods where his organization had once operated. Law enforcement agencies had continued their efforts to eliminate organized crime, successfully prosecuting many of the remaining figures who might have attempted to rebuild criminal enterprises. Perhaps most importantly, the cultural and social changes that had been occurring throughout American society had accelerated, making traditional organized crime activities increasingly obsolete. Joey's initial adjustment to freedom was complicated by the restrictions of supervised release and the continued media attention surrounding his activities. He was required to maintain regular contact with federal probation officers, seek approval for travel and many business activities, and avoid contact with known criminals, a challenging requirement, given his background and the nature of his former associates. The media coverage of his release was extensive and largely focused on speculation about his future plans. Crime reporters and law enforcement officials openly wondered whether Joey would attempt to rebuild criminal enterprises or would genuinely pursue legitimate activities. This scrutiny made every public appearance and business decision subject to analysis and interpretation by people looking for evidence of continued criminal involvement. Joey approached this challenge with the same strategic thinking that had characterized his entire life. He understood that his actions during the supervised release period would largely determine how the rest of his life would unfold. Success in proving his commitment to legitimate activities could provide a foundation for long-term transformation. Failure to convince skeptics of his sincerity could result in continued law enforcement attention and limited opportunities for building a new life. One of Joey's first major decisions after his release was to relocate from Philadelphia to South Florida, a move that represented both practical considerations and symbolic significance. Practically, the move removed him from the neighborhoods and relationships that had defined his criminal career, reducing both temptations and law enforcement concerns about his activities. Symbolically, it represented a clean break from his past and a commitment to starting fresh in a new environment. South Florida in 2015 offered several advantages for someone in Joey's position. The region had a large Italian-American population that might be sympathetic to his story and interested in his legitimate business activities. The tourism industry provided opportunities for restaurant and hospitality businesses that could capitalize on his notoriety while remaining completely legal. Perhaps most importantly, the distance from Philadelphia reduced the likelihood that his activities would be closely monitored by local law enforcement agencies that had been investigating him for decades. Joey's initial years in Florida were characterized by a deliberately low profile. He avoided the kind of high visibility activities that had characterized his time as a mob boss, instead focusing on adjusting to a legitimate lifestyle and exploring business opportunities that might provide sustainable income without attracting unwanted attention. The adjustment wasn't easy. After decades of being one of Philadelphia's most recognizable figures, Joey found himself largely anonymous in South Florida. The power and influence he had once wielded were gone, replaced by the ordinary challenges of building a legitimate business and establishing new relationships in an unfamiliar environment. But Joey also discovered that his notoriety, properly managed, could be a valuable asset in the right circumstances. His story attracted interest from people who were curious about organized crime history, and his personality and communication skills made him an engaging figure for those who got to know him. The challenge was converting this interest into sustainable business opportunities, while maintaining the low profile that was necessary for his continued freedom and success. After several years of maintaining a relatively low profile in Florida, Joey made the decision to return to Philadelphia in 2018. This decision surprised many. Observers who had assumed that he would remain permanently removed from the city where his criminal career had flourished. But Joey's return was motivated by both personal and business considerations that reflected his continued evolution from criminal figure to legitimate businessman. The personal motivations were straightforward. Philadelphia was home, the city where he had been born, raised, and had built his reputation. His family, friends, and the neighborhoods that had shaped his identity were all in Philadelphia. While his years in Florida had been valuable for establishing his commitment to legitimate activities, Joey ultimately wanted to rebuild his life in the city that had always been his true home. The business motivations were more complex, but equally compelling. Joey recognized that his greatest asset was his reputation and story, and that reputation was most valuable in Philadelphia, where people knew who he was and what he represented. A successful, legitimate business in Philadelphia could capitalize on his notoriety while demonstrating his commitment to legal activities in the most convincing way possible. By succeeding in the same community where his criminal career had once flourished. The centerpiece of Joey's return to Philadelphia was the opening of Skinny Joey's Cheese Steaks in South Philadelphia, just blocks from the neighborhoods where he had grown up and built his criminal empire. The restaurant was both a business venture and a statement. Joey Merlino was back in Philadelphia, but this time as a legitimate businessman rather than a criminal leader. The restaurant concept was brilliantly conceived for Joey's particular circumstances. Cheese steaks were an iconic Philadelphia food that tourists and locals alike would seek out, providing a natural customer base that didn't depend solely on Joey's notoriety. The location in South Philadelphia connected the business to Joey's roots and heritage, while remaining accessible to customers from throughout the region. Most importantly, the restaurant business was completely transparent. Every transaction was recorded. Every ingredient was legitimate. And every aspect of the operation could be scrutinized by law enforcement without revealing any illegal activities. Perhaps Joey's most surprising innovation during his reinvention was his embrace of social media as a tool for building his legitimate business and personal brand. This was a remarkable transformation for a man who had spent his criminal career trying to avoid documentation of his activities and associations. Now Joey was voluntarily creating a permanent record of his daily life, business activities, and personal thoughts through platforms like Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Joey's social media presence was carefully crafted to support his legitimate business activities while maintaining the engaging personality that had made him a compelling figure throughout his life. His posts typically featured behind-the-scenes content from his restaurant, interactions with customers, and glimpses into his daily life as a legitimate businessman. The tone was warm and approachable, emphasizing his role as a neighborhood restaurateur rather than his past as a criminal leader. But Joey's social media activities also served a more strategic purpose. By documenting his legitimate activities and interactions, he was creating evidence of his transformation that could be valuable if questions ever arose about his current activities. The transparent nature of social media made it difficult for skeptics to claim that he was secretly involved in criminal activities when his daily life was being broadcast to thousands of followers. The social media strategy was remarkably successful in building both his personal brand and his restaurant business. Joey's posts regularly received thousands of likes and comments from followers who were interested in his story, his food, and his transformation from criminal to legitimate businessman. The engagement translated into real business results with customers. Traveling to Philadelphia, specifically to visit his restaurant, and meet the man who had become famous as one of America's last traditional mob bosses. However, the social media activity also created new challenges and controversies. Traditional organized crime culture had always emphasized secrecy and privacy, viewing public attention as dangerous and counterproductive. Joey's embrace of social media was seen by some as a violation of traditional codes and values, leading to criticism from former associates and organized crime traditionalists. Joey's reinvention as a legitimate businessman wasn't without its challenges and setbacks. In 2018, he faced legal troubles once again when he was charged with illegal gambling activities in connection with a federal investigation of sports betting operations. These charges were particularly concerning because they suggested that Joey might not have completely abandoned criminal activities despite his claims of going legitimate. The 2018 charges resulted in Joey pleading guilty to a federal gambling charge and receiving a 2-year prison sentence. While the sentence was relatively light compared to his previous convictions, it represented a significant setback for his reinvention efforts and provided ammunition for critics who had always been skeptical of his claims about going legitimate. Joey served his sentence at a federal facility in Florida, and upon his release in 2020, he returned to Philadelphia with renewed determination to prove his commitment to legitimate activities. The experience had taught him that his past would always be subject to scrutiny, and that any deviation from complete legality could destroy the new life he was trying to build. The most significant controversy surrounding Joey's reinvention efforts came in 2024, when reports surfaced that he had been formally expelled from the Philadelphia organized crime family due to his social media activities. According to these reports, traditional crime family leadership viewed Joey's public profile and social media presence as violations of fundamental principles about secrecy and discretion that had governed organized crime for generations. The reported expulsion was both a validation of Joey's claims about going legitimate and a source of additional complications for his business activities. On one hand, it suggested that his former criminal associates no longer viewed him as part of their organization, supporting his assertions about transformation. On the other hand, it created new questions about his security and safety, since expelled crime family members had historically been viewed as potential threats who needed to be eliminated. In late 2024, Joey faced another serious challenge when his cheesesteak restaurant was damaged in a fire that authorities determined was arson. The investigation into the fire created renewed speculation about Joey's activities and relationships, with some observers suggesting that the arson might be related to his former criminal associations or current business activities. Joey's response to the arson investigation demonstrated his continued evolution as a public figure and legitimate businessman. Rather than avoiding media attention or declining to cooperate with law enforcement, he publicly addressed the situation, expressed his cooperation with investigators, and emphasized his commitment to rebuilding his legitimate business. The arson investigation also highlighted the ongoing challenges Joey faced in his efforts to build a completely legitimate life, even when he was operating entirely within the law. His past reputation and continued notoriety made him a target for both criminals, who might view him as a threat, and individuals who might seek to profit from association with his famous name. But Joey's handling of the arson investigation also demonstrated how much he had changed from his days as a criminal leader. Rather than responding with violence or intimidation, he relied on legal processes and legitimate business practices to address the challenges facing his enterprise. This approach was both practically necessary for maintaining his legitimate status and symbolically important, for demonstrating his transformation to skeptical observers. As 2024 draws to a close, Joey Merlino, at 62 years old, represents a unique figure in American organized crime history. He is simultaneously one of the last traditional mob bosses and one of the first to successfully transition to a completely legitimate lifestyle while maintaining his public profile and personal brand. His daily life now revolves around operating his restaurant, managing his social media presence, and building relationships within Philadelphia's legitimate business community. He wakes each morning not to plan criminal activities or manage territorial disputes, but to prepare for another day of serving customers, managing employees, and building a sustainable, legitimate business. The transformation hasn't been without costs. Joey's legitimate business activities generate far less income than his criminal enterprises once did. His influence and power are now limited to the scope of his restaurant and social media following rather than extending throughout Philadelphia's criminal underworld. The fear and respect that once protected him have been replaced by the ordinary vulnerabilities of any small business owner trying to succeed in a competitive marketplace. But Joey has also gained things that were impossible during his criminal career. He can operate his business without constantly looking over his shoulder for law enforcement surveillance or rival criminals. He can build relationships based on mutual benefit rather than fear and intimidation. Most importantly, he can go to sleep each night without worrying about indictments, assassinations, or the other occupational hazards that had defined his previous life. His relationship with his family has also evolved during his transformation. The constant stress and danger that had characterized his criminal career have been replaced by the ordinary challenges of running a legitimate business. His loved ones no longer need to worry about his safety or their own security in the same way they did when he was an active criminal leader. Joey's public persona continues to evolve as well. The carefully managed image he had cultivated as a mob boss has been replaced by a more authentic presentation of himself as a reformed criminal trying to build a legitimate life. His social media posts show him interacting with customers, preparing food, and engaging in the mundane activities that characterize legitimate business ownership. The question of whether Joey Merlino has truly changed, or whether his current activities represent merely another sophisticated performance, continues to fascinate observers of American organized crime. Skeptics argue that his transformation is tactical rather than genuine, a calculated effort to avoid further law enforcement attention while maintaining some level of public prominence and income. But the evidence for genuine transformation is substantial. Joey has now spent more time operating legitimate businesses than he spent as an active criminal leader. He has endured significant financial losses, legal challenges, and personal difficulties that would have been unnecessary if his only goal was avoiding law enforcement attention. Most importantly, he has consistently chosen legal responses to problems and conflicts that he might once have resolved through violence or intimidation. The broader significance of Joey's transformation extends beyond his personal story. He represents the end of an era in American organized crime, the last generation of traditional mob bosses who built their reputations through a combination of violence, charisma, and community connections. His successful transition to legitimate activities suggests that even the most hardened criminals can change when circumstances and incentives align properly. Joey's story also illustrates the changing nature of American society and law enforcement. The world that produced traditional organized crime figures like him has largely disappeared, replaced by a society where such criminal activities are increasingly difficult to sustain. Modern law enforcement techniques, financial monitoring systems, and cultural changes have made old-style organized crime largely obsolete. As Joey continues his journey as a legitimate businessman, questions about his ultimate legacy become increasingly important. Will he be remembered primarily as one of America's last great mob bosses, or as a successful example of criminal rehabilitation and personal transformation? The answer may depend partly on how his story concludes. If Joey can maintain his legitimate activities for the remainder of his life, avoiding any return to criminal behavior, his transformation may be viewed as genuine and complete. But if future events reveal continued criminal involvement, or if his legitimate businesses fail, skeptics may view his entire reinvention as an elaborate deception. Joey himself seems aware of these stakes and the importance of consistency in his new life. His public statements and social media posts consistently emphasize his commitment to legitimate activities and his gratitude for the opportunity to rebuild his life within the law. He frequently acknowledges his criminal past while expressing remorse and determination to remain on a legal path. The restaurant business has provided an ideal vehicle for Joey's transformation because it allows him to capitalize on his notoriety while remaining completely transparent about his activities. Every aspect of the restaurant operation can be scrutinized by law enforcement, media, or skeptical observers without revealing any illegal activities. The business succeeds or fails based on the quality of food, service, and customer experience rather than on any criminal enterprises. Joey's return to Philadelphia and his operation of a legitimate business in South Philadelphia have generated mixed responses from the community where he once wielded criminal power. Some longtime residents view him as a neighborhood success story, a man who made serious mistakes but has worked to redeem himself through legal activities and community involvement. Others remain skeptical of his transformation, viewing his restaurant and social media activities as a sophisticated publicity campaign designed to rehabilitate his image while potentially concealing continued criminal involvement. These skeptics point to his past record of deception and manipulation as evidence that his current persona should be viewed with suspicion. Law enforcement agencies continue to monitor Joey's activities, though with less intensity than during his active criminal period. Federal, state, and local agencies maintain awareness of his business operations and public activities, but the level of surveillance and investigation has decreased significantly as evidence has accumulated supporting his claims about going legitimate. The media coverage of Joey's transformation has evolved over time, shifting from initial skepticism to grudging acknowledgement that his legitimate activities appear genuine. Crime reporters who once covered his criminal activities now write about his restaurant business and social media presence, often with a tone of amazement that such a transformation could be successful. Looking forward, Joey faces both challenges and opportunities as he continues building his legitimate business empire and personal brand. The challenges include ongoing skepticism from some quarters, the financial limitations of legitimate business compared to criminal enterprises, and the constant need to prove that his transformation is genuine rather than tactical. But the opportunities are also significant. Joey's story and personality make him a compelling figure for media appearances, speaking engagements, and other legitimate activities that could generate income while supporting his transformation narrative. His restaurant business could potentially be expanded into multiple locations or franchised to other operators who want to capitalize on the brand he has built. Joey has also expressed interest in writing a book about his experiences, which could provide both financial benefits and an opportunity to tell his story in his own words. Such a book would need to be carefully crafted to avoid providing information that could be used by law enforcement while still offering the authentic insights that would make it commercially successful. The social media platform that has been so important to his transformation could also be leveraged for additional legitimate business opportunities. Joey's substantial following and engagement rates make him an attractive partner for legitimate businesses seeking to reach his audience, provided such partnerships are structured carefully to maintain his reformed image. But the ultimate test of Joey Merlino's transformation will be time. Criminal rehabilitation, like personal transformation more generally, is not a single event, but an ongoing process that must be sustained through various challenges and temptations. Joey has now demonstrated his commitment to legitimate activities for several years. But the true measure of his change will be whether he can maintain this commitment for the remainder of his life. The challenges ahead are significant. As Joey ages, he may face health problems or financial difficulties that could test his resolve to remain within the law. Economic pressures on his legitimate businesses could create temptations to return to more profitable criminal activities. Personal conflicts or family problems could trigger responses that reflect his old patterns rather than his new values. But Joey has several advantages that support his continued success as a legitimate businessman. His age and experience have given him perspective on the costs and benefits of criminal versus legitimate life. His public profile makes it difficult to return to criminal activities without detection. Most importantly, he has built relationships and commitments within the legitimate community that provide both incentives and support for maintaining his transformation. His story also provides inspiration for others who might be considering similar transformations. While few people have Joey's specific combination of notoriety, charisma, and business skills, his success demonstrates that even individuals with extensive criminal histories can successfully transition to legitimate activities when they make genuine commitments to change. As we reach the end of Joey Merlino's remarkable story, at least the end of the chapter we can observe as of late 2024, we are left with a narrative that defies easy categorization. This is not simply a story of rise and fall, crime and punishment, or good versus evil. Instead, it is a complex tale of human ambition, adaptation, and the possibility of genuine personal transformation, even under the most challenging circumstances. Joey Merlino began his journey as a skinny kid from South Philadelphia who learned the rules of street life through observation, experience, and careful attention to the example set by the adults in his community. He rose to become one of America's most notorious organized crime figures by combining intelligence, charisma, and ruthlessness in ways that set him apart from both his predecessors and his contemporaries. His reign as Philadelphia's mob boss was marked by innovations that reflected his understanding of how organized crime needed to adapt to survive in the modern era. His embrace of public attention, his sophisticated approach to criminal enterprises, and his ability to maintain community support while operating illegal businesses demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that few criminal leaders have achieved. The fall of Joey's criminal empire was as dramatic as its rise, involving federal investigations that utilized the most advanced law enforcement techniques available, and resulting in convictions that effectively ended the era of traditional organized crime in Philadelphia. His trial and imprisonment marked not just the conclusion of his criminal career, but the end of a chapter in American organized crime history. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Joey's story is its final act, his apparently genuine transformation from criminal leader to legitimate businessman. This transformation required not just changing his activities, but fundamentally altering his identity, relationships, and approach to problem solving. The success of this transformation, while not yet complete or final, represents a remarkable achievement in personal change and social adaptation. And so ends the remarkable saga of Joey Merlino. From the streets of South Philadelphia to the heights of organized crime power, and perhaps to genuine redemption. Today at 62, he's known more for his cheesesteaks and social media presence than for criminal enterprises. Whether this transformation is genuine or just another chapter in the master manipulator's playbook continues to be debated, but the evidence increasingly supports the authenticity of his change. The story of Joey Merlino is ultimately a mirror held up to American society itself, a reflection of our contradictions, our capacity for both great evil and unexpected good, and our enduring belief in the possibility of second chances. In the narrow streets of South Philadelphia, where Joey learned his first lessons about loyalty, power, and survival, we see the microcosm of an immigrant community struggling to define itself within the broader American experiment. Joey's journey illuminates one of the most fascinating paradoxes of American criminal culture: how organized crime has simultaneously represented both the corruption of American values and, in some twisted way, an extreme expression of them. The entrepreneurial spirit that drove Joey to build his criminal empire was the same spirit that eventually enabled his transformation into a legitimate businessman. The charisma and leadership skills that made him a successful mob boss were the same qualities that allowed him to build a following as a restaurant owner and social media personality. This paradox extends to our collective fascination with figures like Joey. Why are we drawn to stories of organized crime leaders? Why do we simultaneously condemn their actions and find ourselves rooting for their success? Perhaps it's because they represent a dark version of the American dream, the idea that anyone, regardless of their background or circumstances, can rise to positions of power and influence through determination, intelligence, and willingness to take risks. Joey's story resonates because it touches on fundamental questions about human nature, the possibility of redemption, and the American capacity for reinvention. Can people truly change? Or are we forever defined by our worst actions? Is it possible to escape the gravitational pull of a criminal past? Or do such histories inevitably corrupt any attempt at legitimate transformation? These questions go to the heart of what we believe about human potential and the nature of justice in a democratic society. In examining Joey's life, we witnessed the complete life cycle of traditional American organized crime. From its roots in immigrant communities seeking protection and opportunity outside mainstream society, through its golden age when crime families wielded significant political and economic power, to its decline in the face of modern law enforcement techniques and changing social conditions. Joey's early years coincided with the final flowering of old-style organized crime when figures like Angelo Bruno could still maintain power through a combination of violence, political corruption, and community support. His rise to leadership occurred during the chaotic transition period when traditional structures were breaking down but new forms of criminal organization had not yet emerged. His eventual downfall reflected the reality that old methods could not survive in an era of electronic surveillance, financial monitoring, and cooperating witnesses. But Joey's transformation also points toward what may be the ultimate evolution of organized crime figures: their transition into legitimate business people who leverage their notoriety and skills for legal purposes. This evolution suggests that the talents that made someone successful in criminal enterprises' leadership ability, strategic thinking, risk assessment, and people management skills can be redirected toward legitimate purposes when circumstances and incentives align properly. The death of traditional organized crime wasn't just the result of law enforcement pressure, though that was certainly a significant factor. It also reflected broader changes in American society that made old-style criminal organizations increasingly obsolete. Immigration patterns changed, reducing the insular ethnic communities that had provided both cover and recruitment for crime families. Economic opportunities expanded, providing legitimate alternatives to criminal enterprises for ambitious young people. Most importantly, cultural values evolved in ways that made the violence and intimidation central to organized crime less acceptable to the communities that had once tolerated or even supported such activities. Joey Merlino's transformation raises profound questions about the possibility of redemption and the appropriate response of society to individuals who seek to change their lives after committing serious crimes. His case is particularly compelling because it involves someone who wasn't just a minor criminal, but a major organized crime figure who had wielded significant power and influence through illegal means. In Joey's case, The evidence suggests that genuine change is not only possible, but can be sustained even under intense scrutiny and skepticism. His transformation required courage, the courage to abandon the power and wealth of criminal leadership for the uncertain prospects of legitimate business. It required discipline, the discipline to maintain legal activities, even when faced with financial pressures and personal conflicts that might have tempted him to return to easier, but illegal solutions. Most importantly, it required authenticity, the authenticity to acknowledge past mistakes while building a new identity based on legitimate values and activities. But the question of redemption isn't just about Joey's personal transformation. It's also about society's willingness to accept and support such changes. American culture has always been ambivalent about second chances, simultaneously celebrating stories of redemption while maintaining skepticism about whether people can truly change. Joey's case tests these competing impulses in particularly dramatic ways. The skeptics have legitimate concerns. Joey's criminal career involved activities that harmed individuals and communities. His leadership of an organized crime family contributed to violence, corruption, and the degradation of legitimate institutions. The victims of his organization's activities didn't get to choose whether to forgive or forget. And some would argue that the consequences of serious criminal behavior should be permanent regardless of subsequent reformation. But the evidence for genuine transformation is also compelling. Joey has now spent more time as a legitimate businessman than he did as an active criminal leader. He has endured significant financial losses, legal challenges, and personal difficulties that would have been unnecessary if his only goal was avoiding law enforcement attention. His business activities are completely transparent and subject to constant scrutiny. Most importantly, he has consistently chosen legal responses to problems and conflicts that he might once have resolved through violence or intimidation. The broader implications of Joey's story extend far beyond his personal circumstances. His successful transformation demonstrates that American society retains the capacity to allow individuals to change and grow beyond their past actions, even when those actions were serious and harmful. This capacity for forgiveness and second chances is one of the most admirable aspects of American culture, reflecting our foundational belief in human dignity and potential for growth. Joey's story also shows that law enforcement agencies can adapt their approaches to focus on rehabilitation and transformation rather than merely punishment and incarceration. While Joey certainly paid a significant price for his criminal activities through imprisonment and ongoing scrutiny, law enforcement agencies have generally supported his transformation efforts rather than attempting to sabotage them. This approach benefits not just individuals like Joey, but society as a whole, since successful rehabilitation reduces the likelihood of future criminal activity. The story illustrates the evolution of American organized crime and the factors that have made traditional criminal organizations increasingly obsolete. The combination of sophisticated law enforcement techniques, modern financial monitoring systems, and changing cultural values has created an environment where old-style organized crime cannot survive. Joey's successful transition to legitimate activities may represent not just personal transformation, but historical necessity, a recognition that the world has changed in ways that make criminal leadership unsustainable. For the neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, where Joey's story began, his transformation provides a complex and sometimes controversial legacy. He remains a reminder of the criminal traditions that once characterized certain aspects of Italian-American culture in these communities. But he also represents the possibility of moving beyond those traditions toward legitimate success and community contribution. The row houses on streets like Broad, where Joey learned his first lessons about loyalty and power, have witnessed the complete transformation of their most famous son. The social clubs where he once planned criminal enterprises now see him as a legitimate businessman who employs local residents and contributes to community events. The restaurants where he once held court as a crime boss now compete with his legitimate cheese steak business. This transformation hasn't occurred without controversy. Some longtime residents view Joey skeptically, questioning whether his change is genuine or merely tactical. Others worry that his continued prominence, even in legitimate activities, glorifies the criminal traditions they would prefer to forget. But many others see his story as proof that people from their neighborhood can succeed through legitimate means, even after making serious mistakes. The restaurant that bears his name has become more than just a business. It is a symbol of transformation and a demonstration that people can change even under the most challenging circumstances. Customers who visit Skinny Joey's cheese steaks are not just buying food. They are participating in a remarkable story of redemption and reinvention that reflects the best possibilities of American society. Politicians, business leaders, and community organizations have generally embraced Joey's transformation, viewing it as beneficial for neighborhood economic development and as evidence that their community can produce success stories even from troubled pasts. This acceptance reflects both the pragmatic recognition that legitimate business activity benefits everyone and the deeper American belief in the possibility of redemption. Joey's story offers important lessons for criminal justice policy and practice. His successful transformation demonstrates that even individuals with extensive criminal histories can become productive members of society when provided with appropriate incentives and opportunities. This suggests that criminal justice policies should emphasize rehabilitation and reintegration rather than purely punitive approaches that offer little hope for positive change. The key factors in Joey's transformation: personal motivation, community support, legitimate business opportunities, and consistent law enforcement that rewarded legal behavior while maintaining appropriate oversight, provide a template for supporting similar changes in other individuals. While few people have Joey's specific combination of notoriety, charisma, and business skills, the fundamental elements of his transformation could be applied more broadly. Joey's case also illustrates the importance of allowing individuals to build new identities based on legitimate activities rather than being permanently defined by past criminal behavior. His ability to become known as a restaurateur and community figure rather than solely as a former crime boss was crucial for his successful reintegration into legitimate society. This suggests that criminal justice policies should support such identity transformation rather than creating barriers that force individuals to remain defined by their criminal histories. The ongoing scrutiny that Joey faces also demonstrates the appropriate balance between supporting rehabilitation and maintaining public safety. Law enforcement agencies continue to monitor his activities, but at a level that allows him to operate legitimate businesses, while providing assurance that any return to criminal behavior would be quickly detected. This balanced approach protects both individual rights and community safety. Joey's relationship with media and his cultivation of a public image provide important insights into the role of publicity in both criminal careers and rehabilitation efforts. During his time as a crime boss, Joey's media savvy and public visibility were innovative strategies that provided both protection and influence. His willingness to engage with reporters and maintain a public presence made him a more complex and humanized figure than the stereotypical secretive mob boss. This same media relationship became crucial for his transformation efforts. Joey's transparency about his legitimate business activities, his social media presence documenting his daily life, and his willingness to discuss his past and present with reporters have all contributed to public acceptance of his change. The media attention that once focused on his criminal activities now documents his legitimate business success and community involvement. The public fascination with Joey's story reflects broader American interests in redemption narratives, true crime stories, and the intersection of criminal and legitimate worlds. His transformation provides a satisfying conclusion to a story that could easily have ended with death, or permanent incarceration outcomes that have characterized most organized crime narratives throughout American history. But the media attention also creates ongoing challenges for Joey's continued success. Every business decision, every social media post, and every public appearance is subject to analysis and interpretation by people looking for evidence of continued criminal involvement, or signs that his transformation might not be genuine. This scrutiny requires constant attention to maintaining the legitimate image he has built, while operating successful businesses that can survive such examination. Joey's story has implications that extend beyond American borders, offering insights into how organized crime figures in other countries might transition to legitimate activities and how societies can support such transformations. Many countries struggle with the legacy of organized crime organizations that once wielded significant power but have been weakened by law enforcement pressure and social change. The Italian experience with former mafia figures who have cooperated with authorities and attempted to build legitimate lives offer some parallels to Joey's story, though the cultural and legal contexts are different. Similarly, the transformation of former organized crime figures in countries like Russia, Japan, and Mexico could potentially benefit from lessons learned from Joey's successful rehabilitation. Joey's use of social media and digital platforms to document his transformation and build legitimate business success also provides a model that could be applicable in other contexts. The transparency and accessibility that modern technology enables can be powerful tools for demonstrating genuine change and building public support for rehabilitation efforts. The international interest in Joey's story, reflected in media coverage from around the world and social media followers from many countries, demonstrates the universal appeal of redemption narratives and the global fascination with American organized crime culture. His transformation from mob boss to legitimate businessman resonates with audiences far beyond Philadelphia or even the United States. As we conclude this journey through 5 decades of Joey Merlino's life, we are left with more questions than answers. And that may be appropriate for a story that continues to unfold. Will his transformation prove permanent? Or will future events reveal weaknesses in his commitment to legitimate activities? How will history ultimately judge a man who is both a dangerous criminal and a successful businessman? What lessons can other individuals and society as a whole learn from his remarkable story? The question of permanence is particularly important because rehabilitation, like personal transformation more generally, is not a single event, but an ongoing process that must be sustained through various challenges and temptations. Joey has now demonstrated his commitment to legitimate activities for several years, but the true measure of his change will be whether he can maintain this commitment for the remainder of his life. Future challenges are inevitable. As Joey ages, he may face health problems or financial difficulties that could test his resolve to remain within the law. Economic pressures on his legitimate businesses could create temptations to return to more profitable criminal activities. Personal conflicts or family problems could trigger responses that reflect his old patterns rather than his new values. The constant scrutiny from law enforcement, media, and skeptical observers creates ongoing stress that could eventually affect his judgment and decision-making. But Joey also has several advantages that support his continued success as a legitimate businessman. His age and experience have given him perspective on the costs and benefits of criminal versus legitimate life. His public profile makes it difficult to return to criminal activities without detection. His legitimate business success has provided both financial resources and personal satisfaction that reduce incentives for returning to illegal activities. Most importantly, he has built relationships and commitments within the legitimate community that provide both incentives and support for maintaining his transformation. The historical judgment of Joey's life and career will likely depend on how his story concludes and how historians and sociologists evaluate the broader significance of his transformation. If he maintains his legitimate activities for the remainder of his life, he may be remembered as a pioneering example of successful criminal rehabilitation and a symbol of American society's capacity for forgiveness and second chances. If future events reveal continued criminal involvement, or if his legitimate businesses fail, he may be viewed as a sophisticated criminal who successfully manipulated public opinion while continuing illegal activities. These questions may never be fully answered, but they are worth asking because they help us understand not just Joey Merlino, but the broader human capacity for change, growth, and redemption. His story reminds us that even the most hardened criminals retain the potential for transformation, and that American society benefits when such transformations are supported and encouraged rather than dismissed and discouraged. Joey's legacy extends beyond his personal transformation to encompass broader questions about criminal justice, social redemption, and the evolution of American organized crime. His story demonstrates that rehabilitation is possible even for individuals who have committed serious crimes and wielded significant criminal power. It shows that law enforcement agencies can adapt their approaches to support positive change while maintaining appropriate oversight. Most importantly, it illustrates the ongoing relevance of American values like second chances, entrepreneurship, and the possibility of reinvention. The neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, where Joey's story began, continue to evolve, shaped by new waves of immigration, economic development, and social change. The criminal traditions that once characterized aspects of these communities have largely disappeared, replaced by legitimate businesses, educational opportunities, and community organizations that provide positive alternatives for ambitious young people. Joey's restaurant serves as both a business and a symbol within this evolving community. It represents the possibility of transformation, the value of hard work and legitimate enterprise, and the ongoing vitality of neighborhood traditions and culture. Customers who visit the restaurant participate in a story that encompasses the full complexity of American urban life, its criminal traditions and legitimate aspirations, its capacity for both harm and healing. The social media presence that has been so important to Joey's transformation also serves as a daily demonstration of his commitment to transparency and legitimate activities. His posts documenting restaurant operations, customer interactions, and community involvement provide a real-time record of his transformation that skeptics can examine for evidence of authenticity. What did you think of Joey's story? Do you believe people can truly change, or is the pull of the old life too strong? The evidence in Joey Merlino's case suggests that genuine transformation is not only possible, but can be sustained, even under the most challenging circumstances. His story challenges us to consider our own beliefs about human nature, the possibility of redemption, and the appropriate response of society to individuals who seek to change their lives after committing serious crimes. If this deep dive into one of America's most fascinating crime figures kept you engaged for the full journey, remember that stories like this complex narratives that resist simple categorization and challenge our assumptions about crime, punishment, and redemption are what make the study of organized crime endlessly compelling. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, forgiveness, and the nature of human character. Joey Merlino's transformation from skinny kid to mob boss to legitimate businessman represents more than just one man's journey. It represents the ongoing evolution of American society, the changing nature of organized crime, and the enduring possibility that people can change for the better when circumstances, incentives, and personal will align properly. His story is ultimately hopeful, not because it minimizes the harm caused by organized crime or suggests that criminal behavior should be excused, but because it demonstrates that even the most seemingly irredeemable individuals retain the capacity for positive transformation. In a world often characterized by cynicism and despair about human nature, Joey's journey offers evidence that change is possible, that redemption is achievable, and that second chances can be earned through sustained commitment to legitimate values and activities. As we close this remarkable tale, we are reminded that every ending is also a beginning. Joey Merlino's story continues to unfold daily in a restaurant in South Philadelphia, in social media posts that document the ordinary activities of a legitimate businessman, and in the ongoing test of whether genuine transformation can be permanent. The final chapter of his story has not yet been written, and that uncertainty is perhaps the most human element of all. Until next time, sleep well and remember, every street has its stories, but few are as captivating as the tale of skinny Joey Merlino, the last Don of Philadelphia, who may have written the most remarkable final chapter of any American organized crime story. His journey from criminal leadership to legitimate business success stands as testament to the enduring American belief that no one is beyond redemption, that second chances are possible, and that the most compelling stories are often those that resist easy categorization or simple moral judgments. In the end, Joey Merlino's legacy may not be his criminal achievements or even his business success, but rather his demonstration that transformation is possible when individuals commit to change and society provides the opportunity for redemption. That legacy, more than any particular crime or legitimate accomplishment, may prove to be his most enduring contribution to American culture and the ongoing story of organized crime in the United States.